Welcome to the Beverly Hills Bar Association's International Family Law Series. I'm Alphonse Provinziano, a certified family law specialist and fellow of the International Academy of Family Lawyers, located here in Beverly Hills, California. In this episode, I have the pleasure to be joined by Habib Díaz Noriega of Sánchez, Escobar, and Prieto to examine family law issues arising between Mexico and California. And I've had the pleasure of knowing Habib for some time and working with him on a variety of cases. And I have to say, he's one of the finest lawyers that I've ever met. And a little bit more about Habib. He is a partner in his firm. He's also a professor of international family law in Mexico, and he focuses his practice exclusively on international related litigation matters, with particular focus on cross-border divorce, custody, and enforcement issues. He regularly advises clients on jurisdictional conflicts, recognition and enforcement of foreign judgments, and child custody and relocation disputes between Mexico and the United States. His practice brings a practical, binational perspective to navigating complex family law matters across legal systems. Let's get to it. Habib, welcome to our podcast on international family law topics.
Alphonse, well, thank you very much for the kind introduction for everyone. And thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this podcast.
It's our pleasure. And I think a challenge that we have in many cases is that in California, we have so many cross-border issues with Mexico and divorces. And a lot of times it's a lack of knowledge, a lack of connection. So we're hoping that you can help enlighten us as to the Mexican family law process, so that when we encounter these cases that involve Mexico, we can understand what the companion process is, and have greater knowledge in that field. One of the major things that we always think about is, form selection. If there's an international case, if you can file in California, you can file in Mexico. One of the first things is how is the form selected in Mexico? How does Mexico acquire jurisdiction in a divorce case?
Well, great question. First, in order to understand how forum works, is that in Mexico, at least so far, we have 32 states. So family law is considered state law. So first, then we have 32 Code of Civil Procedures in all Mexico. So you need to go to the specific statute in order to determine if some form is available for a divorce petition or a divorce application to be filed. Uh, but anyway, also it's important to say that based on recent amendments, we have in place this National Code of Civil and Family Proceedings that is going to be superseding all the 32 Code of Civil Procedures in all states. So we're going to have some sort of a uniformity code now in Mexico, but it is not effective now in all 32 states because the decision actually is about each one of the governments of each state because they need to make changes because we are basically changing the way of giving justice because everything was in written form. So now we're moving to oral proceedings, like in the US. So,
It's a time of change for Mexico. With there's a lot of reforms, and obviously, this is a situation in flux. It sounds like because in the U.S. We're very similar because each state has its own code of civil procedure. It's very similar in many ways. There's the California Code of Civil Procedure, the Arizona Code, and we don't really have a national code. So Mexico is now moving in terms of uh, code of civil procedure to be national in family law throughout the country.
right, exactly. And why is that? because you have different criteria in each state depending on the topic that is being subject to the controversy before a court of law. So
Mm.
now going to the this question that you made about forum, uh, usually you have to consider for divorce two concepts. The first one is marital domicile. And the marital domicile is basically where both spouses live together under the same roof. And
Right.
they decided for this place to be basically their home. And the other concept is about this spouse who was abandoned by the other spouse. So, talking about the first category, it's kind of easy to determine which is going to be the marital domicile. But sometimes gets complicated when you're talking about an international couple and very wealthy couple that basically are living all over the world. So, and they have different places where they live, maybe Mexico, US, Europe, etc. So we have faced some problems in some cases to determine that. And we usually consider the intention of the parties to make one specific place their home. And
And I'm curious, Habib, is it if both parties are Mexican nationals, is that an automatic jurisdiction in Mexico under Mexican law, or could it be even if they're Mexican nationals, if they're living somewhere else, they maybe lose their ability to have a marital jurisdiction in Mexico?
oh, very good question. Actually, nationality has nothing to do with
Hmm.
the jurisdiction issue. You can be a national or not, but you have a marital domicile located in Mexico. The courts will have jurisdiction to solve your case.
Very similar to the US, and obviously very contrasting to what we see in Europe, where you can have people that are both nationals of France or England, and they can just file in England, even if they're residing in the US or Mexico. I'm kind of curious. Is marital domicile in terms of the intent? Can you just come and say, "It's my intent to be domiciled in Mexico," and thus gain jurisdiction, or is it you have to have facts like you lived here for a significant period of time? Tell us a little bit about that.
Right. The way it works is that yes, the intention is very important to determine the marital domicile, but also the timing, like you're saying right now, and that is something to point out because you require more than 6 months
Right,
in order for this marital domicile to become this marital domicile.
right. And what's the time for, is there a hard and fast time frame rule in Mexico? Is it 6 months, or is it more just a length of time?
The way that it works is that we do have a specific chapter dealing with residency. So, about this concept is really clear that you have two elements. First, the one that is objective in a way that you are living in a certain place, and the second one is the intention. But the additional one in this specific chapter provides that you need to live there for more than 6 months.
Hmm.
Otherwise, cannot be considered your residence.
It's
And
so similar to California in that way.
right, exactly. So you linked this chapter to the marital domicile, and then the clear conclusion is that you need 6 months in order to have a marital domicile.
And tell us a little bit about the abandoned spouse jurisdiction, because that's not something that we're really familiar with.
Right. So about the second category, the abandoned spouse, and we had a case down here. and actually was a couple living in the U.S. And the opposing counsel was arguing that the marital domicile was located here because this individual was the one who was abandoned, but this individual was living all the time in the US. So it doesn't make any sort of sense because
Right.
the abandoned spouse is first, they determine that they're going to live in the US or Mexico. So the abandoned spouse is the one remaining behind. And even
Hmm.
more when you're dealing with international cases, because the spouse who left the country is not the abandoned spouse,
Hmm. Hmm.
is the one left behind.
Right. Right. So does that, so if the spouse in Mexico gets left behind, you can still bring the case in Mexico under Mexican law, even if the other spouse has gone to another location. Is that the gist of the jurisdiction?
Exactly.
And I'm kind of curious, something that we look at a lot, and I know that you've you've testified as an expert quite a bit in form nonconvenience cases in the U.S. and have worked on them in their equivalent in Mexico. What are the considerations for inconvenient form motions in Mexico? Well, how will the court look at that? If you, let's say you've got a case going in California for a couple that's filed for divorce because one of the spouses lives here in California, the other spouse lives in Mexico, and vice versa. You have a competing action in Mexico. How is the Mexican court going to tackle a form nonconvenience motion in such a circumstance?
Right. Well, the concept of foreign inconvenience is not considered in the procedural code. So the way
Mm,
it works, if you have, let's say, two ongoing proceedings about the same issue, one in the US and other one in Mexico, well, you will need to fast forward a little bit your proceeding in the US in order to have a final judgment. And that
mm,
will be the only way to say, well, the only ruling prevailing here has to be the one delivered in the US, not the Mexican one. So there are no way uh, to explain to the judge a foreign inconvenience case down here. The only way to solve that is by the U.S. Council to move forward and faster than the Mexican one, and then you that would be the one to be prevailing.
So it's really in terms of competing divorce cases, it's really a race to the finish line. It sounds like Mexico will recognize a U.S. judgment in a U.S. case if it gets to the judgment first. But if the Mexican courts get first, then in Mexico they're going to say that that's the controlling um, controlling judgment. Is that right?
Exactly, exactly, and even more gets much more complicated when you're talking about a divorce in which the this couple had children,
Mm,
because as a matter of human rights, the best interest of children is in the category of human right and
mhm,
is above these all forum rules. So if the judge considered that it's in the best interest for the children to have jurisdiction, that supersedes everything else, you know?
mhm, mhm,
Why is that? For instance, we have had cases where the children are located in the US, but one of the parents is located in Mexico and they filed for divorce. But along with the divorce petition or application, the other spouse asked for child support on behalf of the kids. So
Mhm.
the court is unable to say, I reject this case because everyone is located in the US, etc., because the judge must protect children based on this best interest.
And so they'll just even ignore another like the US's judgment and kind of swoop in and say we're going to focus on custody and support here in Mexico because it's a basic human right.
Exactly, pretty much.
Have you seen that play out in real life where there's been a race to a judgment in Mexico?
Yes. And the first discussion actually is having an ongoing litigation in Mexico. So therefore, the U.S. court, they file motions to reject the case in the U.S. based on from non-convenience because they already
Right.
have an an ongoing proceeding in Mexico.
Mhm.
But and we're currently handling a very specific case regarding this specific subject. And basically, we are discussing this first, the foreign non-convenience
Mhm.
issue.
Mhm. And have you had experience where, you've worked a little bit as an expert in form nonconvenience cases in the US. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and involvement as an expert on form nonconvenience cases in the US?
Right. Well, sometimes what has happened in some cases is that they either corporations or citizens or foreigners bring lawsuits before the U.S. courts. And first, the specific questions for a Mexican expert is that if there is some sort of an action for these individuals or entities available down here. And yes, actually, yes, there are a lot of actions, but sometimes are worded differently, but they're aiming for the same goal. Or sometimes, even though uh, they ask, well, am I going to receive the same amount of money in Mexico? Because we are dealing with US dollars and in Mexico with Mexican peso. But the straight answer is that you have a remedy available. It doesn't matter what is going to be the amount to be awarded, but you have an action. Additionally, all the issues in connection with the language barrier,
Mhm. Mhm.
because uh, all, all the documents here in Mexico, the official language is Spanish. So, for a case to be tried in the US is kind of hard, and even more if you have tons of documents to be translated into English. And the implications for that is really costly for the parties, and even more for the judge to understand. And even more if you're dealing with documents having legal terminology, because you will have to explain what the specific scope of all these documents mean, or what is the binding effect between the parties. And additionally, also, we have had like prenups where is not included a specific provision dealing with jurisdiction, and they are having assets all over the world. So those are the kind of explanations that are given to the judge in order to say, well, you have an available form here because you have a specific authority, meaning the Mexican courts, pursuant to the substantial or substantive law. Uh, there are some sort of actions that you can bring here, and they are kind of similar like in the US. Might not have the same economic impact, but we do have them here. So those are the kind of explanations I would give. And even more if you're talking about domestic abuse cases and
Hmm.
charges have been pressed before the Mexican authorities, all the criminal investigation is carried out in Spanish. And sometimes you have huge case files. So the judge basically concludes, well, you have an available forum, you got to go down there.
Right. It's fascinating because it's obviously something that you'll see in an international divorce case with assets all over the world. How which form is going to be best, and it sounds like a big consideration is, if we're dealing with voluminous documents or marriage agreements, that there's a huge burden on translation and understanding the property disclosures and everything. And that may, in California, we deal with that as we have public factors and private factors that the courts have to consider in an inconvenient form. So, under the California Code of Civil Procedure, all those private factors could really pile up and be very expensive to have the translators come, the experts from Mexico. One of the things that I've seen people argue against now, with especially in California, where you have Zoom as a way that you can testify, they'll say, well, people can come and testify via Zoom. We have a certified Spanish to English language interpreters available, but it's still a little bit more nuanced when it's a document, right? And the judge is having to look at it. You have to have an official translation of it. I'm really curious to be. This is something that's a little different for us in the U.S., but I've seen it in Mexican cases. Is that in Mexico, when you get married, is there the ability to select your property regime that you're using? And maybe you could talk a little bit about that to us and tell us how that impacts a Mexican family.
Right. We have, let's say, three categories. One is separate property regime, the other one is community property regime, and the third one is a mixture of both.
Mm.
But to be honest, the way that it works here is that you need to fill in a form and you have only two choices. Because at the civil registry in this form, you have two boxes and you just gotta check in the box either separate or community property. And there is no explanation by a civil registry official to say, hey, you're able to choose for a third regime, meaning a mixture of both. So what happens usually is that you or the parties or the spouses only choose either separate or property or community property. And also, in some states, it's being required for an agreement to be in place, a prenuptial agreement. That is an additional requirement in order to for the parties to be very clear about the provisions that are going to be dealing with this regime, for instance.
And it's really interesting. Is it something that's very, widespread? People know, look, I'm going to get married. I'm at the civil marriage registry, and we're going to check the box. We're going to decide, are we going to have a separate property marriage or a community property, or is it something where people maybe don't understand it in your experience? Have you seen both, or is it just more prevailing? Like people understand when you're going to get married, you're going to pick how you're going to deal with your property.
Uh, well, the issue is that this civil registry official never explains the legal
Mm,
consequence for that. So
right,
sometimes the option, given the emotion of the moment, it is not
right,
clear for the spouses. And
right.
actually, we dealt with a case about an international couple, and they came down here like some sort of Las Vegas, moment, and they got married in Mexico, and the end result was that they chose for the community property regime.
Mm,
And eventually, the problem was when this individual passed away, well, the spouse said, the widow said, well, 50% for me. But
right,
there was a huge fight with the children that he had from a previous marriage. So there was a huge discussion about the validity of choosing this regime, and even more, talking about foreigners who do not understand Spanish because
right,
all the paperwork, the explanations, the ceremony was carried out in Spanish.
right.
So, what about the consent? And we provided expert opinions about that, saying,
And what was your opinion? I'm curious.
well, that an individual that doesn't speak Spanish is not able to understand this form, for instance, and even more the legal consequences for that. Therefore,
Right,
this concept cannot be considered. Therefore, is this some sort of agreement, even if it is just checking in the box, is
right.
null and void.
That's and so that was the ruling of the Mexican court that even though they checked that box that it wasn't going to apply as community property, and then the kids got they got basically the inheritance.
That was the opinion that we gave because the case
Hmm.
was tried in the US.
Oh,
So
interesting.
we gave all the explanation about this consent issue, and
Hmm.
we heard that they settled basically. But it was kind
It
of
sounds like that was a good decision, right?
right, exactly.
You know, it's really interesting because we have a case that's an old case from the 60s called Marriage of Fernandez, and it upholds the Mexican uh, selection process. It decides that it's a prenup under California law and upholds it, saying, you know, you validly selected a separate property regime for your marriage, which exempts you from California's community property because everything's a 50-50 division unless you have a prenup. So it allowed these spouses to have a separate property, similar kind of a case to yours, but it was a long time ago. Obviously, the 60s are we're going back almost, 50, 60 years now. And so there's not really a more relevant recent case. And I think it's really interesting because as California practitioners, if you have parties that are coming from Mexico, you have to think about, well, what did they select if they were married in Mexico? And what can you use that for as your selection of the marital regime? There is case law that says it's enforceable, but I think it might be difficult to really enforce it under the current case law in California because the current case law says, you have to understand what you're doing. You have to understand the significance. So that was why I was kind of curious if people just generally knew this in Mexico, or it's because the civil registry, marriage registry, they don't explain it to you. So they just kind of check the box, kind of figure out what makes sense to them.
Exactly. That's kind of the thing that happens when they go to the civil registry.
Mm.
But it's also important to mention that in Mexico, we have like something not new. It has been actually included in the civil code for Mexico City 20 years ago, and then was replicated all over Mexico. When the spouses actually chose for the separate property regime, that is very clear that they're not going to be sharing anything whatsoever. Uh, well, the Mexico City government thought, well, in Mexico, as a matter of cultural thing, the woman is in charge of the kids, of the house and everything, and pretty much uh, waves to a professional life, earning money.
Hmm. Right.
Well, why is that? Because in order for the man to be the one successful,
Right.
economically successful, make money, and they, well, saw this situation happening that a couple got married, they got kids, the wife was taking care of everything at home, and then the husband was going out making money, they got divorced, and the separate property regime was in place. So therefore, the woman was left without anything. And
Wow.
they thought, well, we're going to make some changes to the divorce law and say, well, uh, women must have a compensation because it is kind of a job to be at home and taking care of everything.
Right.
The husband needs to be sharing all these profits made, all these earnings made during the course of marriage. And this provision pretty much says that a compensation shall be awarded and it may be up to 50% of the total value of all the assets acquired during marriage.
So it's a huge exception then. Even if you check separate property, if you're the spouse that's basically the supporting spouse, you can kind of get your way into community property at 50% division.
Sounds like exactly, but
Yeah.
that is included as a compensation and talking about international cases. What has
Mhm.
been happening, and we have been consulted for that, is the question is about this compensation. If it applies to um, all marriages under Mexican law, even
Oh,
though
interesting.
if you move your residence abroad. So there
Right.
are a lot of Mexican couples, for instance, that they live in California or Texas, and well, they get divorced, and usually the woman is the one claiming for this compensation in the US. So the
Mhm.
real question is, Mexican law does apply even in the US about this compensation remedy or not?
Right. I mean, it's really interesting because I think what in California, what we would focus on is if we have jurisdiction, even if you're from a foreign country, we're going to apply community property laws to you. Even if but the interesting thing is if you come in and you say, well, wait a minute, we have the Mexican, we have a Mexican marriage certificate where we selected separate property.
Mhm.
That's going to be a huge battle. And I think you would really want to then say, fine, you're going to apply Mexican separate property, but then if you're going to apply that, you've also got to apply the argument that under Mexican law that you've got this compensation. That's going to be a little bit more attenuated because I think if the court finds that the separate property is in place through the agreement, it may not find that then Mexican law applies. They may just say, we're going to enforce this agreement you have, but we don't have any reciprocal rights to have to enforce Mexican law. So in that case, the wife really needs to do a race to the judgment in Mexico to get res judicata there and have a form nonconvenience motion that's granted in the U.S. Otherwise, I think she might be out of luck, which is unfortunate. I do think that the interesting thing is that, and this, like I said, the Fernandez case was a lot older. Now you can strike down a prenup in California based on unconscionability and enforcement, which is the exact same thing. Basically, the Mexican law kind of really tracks the US law or and vice versa on this. So if you have a prenup where the supporting spouse gets 100% gets nothing and the other spouse gets 100% of everything, everything's separate property, then that can be voided as an unconscionable agreement at the time of enforcement. And so that's for all prenups post 1999. So it's kind of an interesting, it's an interesting kind of notable similarity. And obviously, Habib, we have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In California, we have to adopt community property and through most of the Western US, but everywhere is a little different. In California, community property is any assets that are acquired during marriage, it's 50-50. It's the exact same thing in Mexico. Is there any nuances to that? Other than in California, inheritances are separate property, premarital assets are separate property, but is it basically the same in Mexico?
Yeah, if you're talking about community property, it's kind of the
Hmm.
same thing.
Hmm.
Inheritance cannot be considered as an additional portion to be shared with the other spouse, for instance. Or if you win the lottery ticket,
Hmm.
well, that is something that you will not share with your spouse, for instance.
Really? See, in
Exactly.
California, there's been cases that have been set aside, divorces, because there was somebody who won the lottery during the marriage, didn't disclose it in their divorce, tried to get divorced, and the whole judgment gets set aside because that's community property. But so certain winnings are separate property in Mexico, like lottery winnings and other things.
Right, like inheritance. That
Hmm.
cannot be shared. And
Hmm.
but the issues, for instance, here, going back to this problem about compensation,
Hmm.
everything can be considered for compensation. So it's even
Hmm.
worse sometimes when you're dealing with a separate property regime and the provision provides that all the assets acquire up to 50%. So it's kind
Wow.
of even worse just to checking the box. So the advice that we have provided to our clients is you better have a prenup in place and be very clear
Right.
about your intention.
And what are the requirements in Mexico to accept a prenup? It's particularly like a foreign prenup, but just in general, like how do you have a acceptable prenup in Mexico?
Right. Well, for a prenup, either you execute this prenup and it's being delivered to the civil registry official. So
Hmm.
that would be one way to be considered as valid and enforceable. And the
Hmm.
other one is if you execute that prior to the marriage, but you need
Hmm.
to execute this before a notary public.
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting. And is there have to be, do both sides have to have like a lawyer or a notary involved in order to um, in order to have a valid prenup, or can just the parties just do a prenup on their own?
They can do their prenup on their own. There is no legal requirement in order to receive any sort of advice by an attorney.
Hmm.
Better
Hmm.
understand what they're going to be executing.
Mm. Hmm. Got it. And it is something interesting that comes up a lot in California. We'll hear people just out of curiosity, they'll say like a notary in Mexico means a completely different thing than in the US. For the people listening, maybe you could explain it a little bit for our listeners. Obviously, a notary in the US is someone that records official documents and maintains a registry of them so that if they're contested, you can say, no, that was an authenticated signature where I took a fingerprint. But I get the sense that a notary has more powers in Mexico. And maybe you could just tell us a little bit about that, just so that we can understand that as American lawyers.
Right. Considering that Mexico is a civil law country, so we have different statutes in place, and one
Hmm.
of them is dealing with this notary public function.
Hmm. Hmm.
And here in Mexico, differently from the US, is that a notary public first requires a law degree.
Oh, interesting.
Why is that? Because that's the way it's being provided in the specific statute. And why is that? Because one of the purposes of the notary public is to give full faith and credit of several transactions, for instance, or several agreements, because
Mhm.
in different provisions, there are certain agreements that need to be executed before a notary public. And in
Mhm.
order for a notary public to give this full faith and credit, first needs to understand what the parties are going to be executing before him.
Right.
So that is the rationale behind that a notary public needs a law degree in order to become a notary public. And additionally, in order to become a notary public, it's not like you just go to a specific office and obtain this certificate. You need to pass several exams because there is like some sort of an association of notary publics in each state. And for instance, in Mexico, they need to pass like some sort of like the bar exam.
Mm,
So it is not that easy to become a notary public here in Mexico.
interesting. And they serve a more extensive, they do more extensive services than our notary publics as well.
Right. For instance, prenups is one
Hmm.
of agreements that they participate, giving full faith and credit, or transactions dealing with real estate. Here in Mexico, in order to have in place an agreement in which you're going to be transferring assets, meaning real estate, to a third party, you need a notary public. Why is that? Because the notary public is going to give full faith and credit, but additionally, is going to have this agreement recorded before the real estate registry, for instance. The notary public participates uh, in corporations. Uh, why is that? Because we have a specific, it's a federal statute talking about corporations. And there is being provided that you need a notary public in order to have this agreement in place, for instance. Why is that? Because to give certainty of the parties that are gonna be investing their money in a specific vehicle, meaning this corporation, for instance. Uh, Also, they participate in the creation of entities that comes from a civil law perspective, like law firms. It is not considered like a corporation dedicated mostly to make profits, but to serve, the people. Also, you require a notary public to have this some sort of an entity in place. Uh, this this is a kind of similar services that they provide. Um, Also, what happens here in Mexico that uh, we have very long names because I don't know, maybe Spanish tradition, and we also our last name is we have one from the father, one from the mother, etc. So sometimes people here start uh, using one name or the other name, and then they omit certain portion of the name, and eventually they're obtaining several IDs, signing different documents. So you can go to a notary public, and a notary public can give you a certificate saying all these individuals are the same person. But
Wow.
So those are the
Fascinating.
kind of problems that happens down here, for instance, and the notary public is the one to go to.
And I'm kind of curious on sort of an unrelated topic, but something that comes up quite a bit. And I know you and I have had conversations about this in the past. Is so you have your support order, a child support order, spousal support order from the US. You've got someone that is has some resources in Mexico, and maybe they're living in Mexico, they're working in Mexico, and they've decided they're not coming back to the US. They're not having a US bank account. All their resources are in Mexico. Can you take that child support order or that spousal support order from California and enforce that in Mexico? And if so, tell us a little bit about the process to do that.
Right. First, if this is a preliminary decision, it's not enforceable. You need a final judgment, a res judicata. Only res judicata is able to be enforced in Mexico. Uh, what are the requirements for this domestication proceeding in Mexico? One of the most important ones is that you had a personal service in place. Why is that? Because in Mexico, due process is understood to have a personal service.
Hmm.
And what we have faced in some other cases is that given that the other individual is located in Mexico, and you need to have this personal service in place, so you will need to go through the Mexican court system through a letter rogatory process in order to have this personal service. Otherwise, one of the defenses that this individual is going to be raising down here to oppose to the domestication is that he never received this notice or service.
Hmm.
Well, additionally, they require a certified copy of the judgment, and this judgment needs to be apostille and then translated into Spanish because the official language, Spanish again.
Hmm.
And,
Right.
and also a request from the court to enforce this as a matter of international cooperation. And finally, you will need to file some sort of a petition asking the court to domesticate this US judgment, for instance, and you will need to provide the factual background that end up with this judgment and provide the specific domicile of the individual that is located in Mexico.
Have you
And
hit have you hit any roadblocks doing this for people, enforcing judgments, enforcing money judgments, enforcing support judgments in Mexico?
well, yes, why is that? First, because one of the usual defenses that they raise are these formalities that I mentioned. The other one that they raise are the ones related to the public policy, because family law, we have a strong public policy arguments here. So if there is some sort of a incompatibility between the US judgment and the Mexican law, the judge is empowered to reject the domestication request or deny it.
And so really is in terms of best practices, if you know that the defendant is in Mexico, is it better to consult with a Mexican attorney to kind of figure out how can we craft this order so that it's not going to be void under Mexican law?
Exactly. Exactly. In order for for instance, the wording and the compatibility is very clear for the Mexican judge. And
Hmm.
then the defendant party or respondent party uh, won't have any sort of chance to prevail on this type of defenses. Or we have implemented some other strategies because, as I have explained before, if you're dealing with child support, kids are entitled to file a petition here directly against this individual.
Wow.
Spousal support is something different. You will
Hmm.
go through the US court system first, and then you will have to go to a Mexican court to enforce this, for instance. There might be some arguments for a wife to file maybe for spousal support, because also talking about human rights, uh, here in Mexico, there is a huge development about protecting women because they are in some sort of disadvantage because of historical issues, cultural issues, economical issues. So, uh, what they have considered is that they need to be equal. And given that they are not equal, the law needs to provide this equality and therefore the judge. So if this woman is not protected but by some other authorities, I'm as a Mexican judge will protect you. That is pretty much the idea. So yeah, they're switching kind of the understanding, for instance, for jurisdiction in order to protect, because that is the focus of the judges now, for instance.
That's fascinating. And it kind of is an interesting topic to talk about with all the changes and the issues with cartels, changing governments. What's it like to be a lawyer in Mexico today? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, first, being a lawyer, uh, you need to re-study law, basically, and to continue to study everything because based on these new changes, for instance, the way to litigate down here is not like you're doing it from your desk. Now you need to go to
Right.
the court, you need to explain your case to the judge, like in the US, have a hearing and objecting or challenging whatever decisions are being made during the course of the hearing. So you need to have all court precedents in place and learn and study it. And it's even harder than in the US, I guess, so far, because they do not allow you to bring, your mobile or any device, electronic device. So you need to bring papers with you, and
Wow.
therefore you're unable to check, something that might be useful for your case. So you gotta be really prepared for this type of hearing.
Hmm.
And obviously,
Right,
we're
because it used to be that everything was mostly done in writing in Mexican legal proceedings. So the new reforms in place are to have more of a like an evidentiary style hearing process in family law and in other areas.
in family law mostly. Uh,
Hmm. Hmm.
the problem is that you have, like in the US, several court precedents, and at some point during the hearing, there is a chance that some discussions are going to be made by the parties, but you don't have access to the database of the Mexican Supreme Court of Justice to check a specific court precedent. So you are
Hmm.
unable to argue this before a court of law. So this is something like, for instance, we are exchanging ideas with the judiciary to say,
Hmm.
well, nowadays, it is even a human right to have access to
Hmm.
technology, even more if you're going to go to
Mm.
trial and
Right.
you are the counsel for this corporation or this individual. And so this is very challenging.
I
And
can't even imagine. Yeah. If you go into a US court, every lawyer's got their laptop they're bringing in or their tablet. And we're bringing in exhibits on iPads and, pulling out your phone to look at your calendar for new dates. So that's got to be extremely challenging and just a sea change in how you do everything. It's got to be very difficult and very different. And I'm kind of curious, is there anything in terms of do you have any perception? We hear a lot in the US about cartels. Do the cartels have any kind of sway over the legal system that you've seen, or how is that affecting lawyers, or are any of the reforms helping with that?
um, I would say that depends on the practice area.
Mm,
Because usually when you're dealing with cartels, it's organized crime, etc., you are dealing with criminal law.
right.
Which, so yeah, there have been a lot of complaints
Hmm.
because of these amendments to the federal judiciary and local judiciary, because judges now are being elected by vote,
Mm,
and there's no previous screening about, you know, background check of these
right.
individuals, and there have been a lot of issues, and you can see that in the media that there are some uh, lawyers that were elected, and they were lawyers for the cartels.
Oh, interesting.
So
Interesting.
there were a lot of complaints before the Senate, because the Senate was the one checking all the profiles and saying, well, yes, this individual complies with each and all requirements and honesty, morality, but they didn't do the job, you know? So
Wow.
there is a concern, yes. Very recently in Mexico, what happened, I guess a couple of days ago, a criminal attorney was assassinated,
Wow.
stepping out of the courts. So
Wow.
uh, for the criminal practice, is kind of hard. It works differently when you're dealing with the commercial cases, for instance, because you're dealing
Right.
with much more corporations. And talking about family law, well, there have been some attempts of assassination, but it is not that common. It is much more common when you're dealing with these issues about cartels and criminal attorneys, etc., all over Mexico.
That's got to be obviously a real, you know, kind of concern. I mean, even if you're not implicated in it, the thought that a lawyer can get assassinated outside of a courthouse is kind of terrifying. Have and with all of the issues with deportations from the U.S., have you seen how that's affected any families in Mexico in terms of child custody issues and how the Mexican court systems are dealing with that right now?
Right. What has been happening is that the workload for the family courts has increased, because yes, these couples, one U.S. citizen, the other one Mexican one, and what are they supposed to do with the kids? And sometimes
Right,
when you're the one that is being deported is the mother, usually the kids come with the mother to Mexico.
right, right.
And then, because the woman or the mother is unable to return to the US, they what they are asking for advice is how do I solve this? And the only way is through the Mexican court system because they're unable to return because of the deportation. And yes, there are a lot of cases happening right now. And the idea of the Mexican government is to assist all these immigrants that were living in the US and also for the courts. Uh, and you're seeing this more and more nowadays.
Um, Habib, it's just been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And I think all your insights are going to be so helpful to anyone engaging in cross-border practice with Mexico. I just wanted to say a big thank you from the Beverly Hills Bar Association for meeting with us today and sharing all your knowledge with us.
You're very welcome. The privilege was mine. And thanks everyone for hearing this podcast. And they can look for me down here in Mexico. I'm at your service.